Okay, so now, everybody watch what you're saying. Now it is official. All right, tonight we're going to be in Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy. Deutero second. Nami from the Greek word nomos, which is law. Torah in the Hebrew, nomos in the Greek. So it is called Deuteronomy, second law. It's set up as a selection of sermons that Moses gives on his way to his death. At the very end of Deuteronomy, we have the death of Moses narrated. But we're going to be reading from 3 different spots tonight. So let's look first of all in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy 5. We're going to be reading verses 1 through 3. Tonight we're going to talk about justice and obedience. That's going to be where we focus our discussion. So Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 through 3 to start. Hear, Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today. Learn them and be sure to follow them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. It was not with our ancestors that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive here today. Okay, that's the first section. Now let's turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 10. Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 and 13. Deuteronomy 10, 12 to 13 says, And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good. Okay. One more tonight. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 1 to 10. Deuteronomy 27, verses 1 to 10. Here we go. Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, keep all these commands that I give you today. When you have crossed the Jordan into the land the Lord your God has given you, set up some large stones and coat them with plaster. Write on them all the words of this law when you have crossed over to enter the land the Lord your God has given you, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. And when you have crossed the Jordan, set up these stones on Mount Ebal, as I command you today, and coat them with plaster. Build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron tool on them. Build the altar of the Lord your God with field stones and offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God. Sacrifice fellowship offerings there, eating them and rejoicing in the presence of the Lord your God. And you shall write very clearly all the words of this law on these stones you have set up. Then Moses and the Levitical priests said to all Israel, be silent, Israel, and listen. You have now become the people of the Lord your God. Obey the Lord your God and follow his commands and decrees excuse me, that I give you today. Pardon me. Let me give you a little introduction here. A certain fable depicts the story of a kite and its owner. The kite enjoyed being taken outside and flying high above the ground, but the kite could only go as far and high as the length of its string. One day, the kite began to complain about its lack of freedom. It isn't fair for me to be held back by my owner's string. If only I could break loose from him, I could go wherever I wanted. Well, soon after, the kite's wish came true when the string broke. And for a few moments, the kite relished its newfound freedom, but a sudden strong gust of wind came along, and the kite soon found itself unable to control its flight. Before long, the wind swept the kite into a tangle of tree branches. The briefly free kite now hung captive. The freedom the kite longed for was its eventual ruin. God's requirements are for our benefit. Any perceived restrictions on our freedoms are in our best interest. He intends that we accept his will as our own so that we might become a blessing for the world. This lesson this week highlights several times when the people of God are reminded of those edicts, if you will, as they are called to create a just society in witness to the just God they served. All right. And that's what we're doing here. And we're doing it from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, as I mentioned, is the fifth of 5 books of what is called the Torah. Your Hebrew Bible is broken up into 3 parts. Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. And it's commonly called, if you've ever heard it called this, you may have heard somebody call it the Tanakh. And that's the T, the Torah, the N for the Nevi'im, and the K for the Ketuvim. Now, the Nevi'im are the prophets. Navi is a prophet. And the Ketuvim are the writings. And so basically what you've got is 3 different sections. Now, our Old Testament, which corresponds to the Hebrew Bible, is ordered differently and is not necessarily broken up into those kinds of categories. But obviously, you've got, at the very beginning, you've got the law, and then you've got history writings. Then you've got a bit of writings like Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Psalms, kind of packed in there into the middle. And then from Isaiah on, you've got the prophets with Lamentations side by side with Jeremiah. And Lamentations actually more of a writings, but because of its ties with Jeremiah, it sticks with Jeremiah there in the prophets. So you've got that in there. So Deuteronomy, a wonderful, wonderful book. And that's where we're reading from. And the other thing to kind of get us into the flow of what Deuteronomy is really teaching is how to live in covenant with God. Covenant. And I want to do a little bit of work with that here. Covenants, basically, when one entered into a covenant, the term was you cut a covenant. It was kind of a violent image of cutting a covenant together with somebody. And it had a whole lot more holding it together than some of the covenants that we enter into nowadays. It really did. Now, one of the things I'll tell you about these is that these agreements, these covenants, often included kind of like a historical narrative, stipulations for the submission of the lesser party, because most of the time covenants were made between lesser parties, more powerful and less powerful. Like treaties. You're going to end a war, you're going to enter into a covenant with each other or a treaty with each other. This is the kind of thing that is. It's an agreement. And so what would happen is there would also be curses and blessings if there was disregard or obedience if you upheld your end of the covenant. For pagan cultures, covenants provided legal precedent for how parties were to relate to one another, especially if power differential was present. All right. So throughout Israel's history, God made several covenants with his people. Each detailed a different aspect of his commitment to and his expectations for the Israelites. Now, this text today describes how Israel was to commemorate and commit to the covenant God made with them at Sinai. Okay, so it's a reminder of that covenant that God made with them at Sinai, where we hear the 10 Commandments for the very, very first time. All right, so let's get into this. Look with me at verse 1 there. And you don't have to, I'm sorry, it's in 3 different places. Chapter 5, verse 1. It says, "Hear, Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today. Learn them and be sure to follow." How does obedience start? What's the first thing you have to do? In order to be obedient, what's one of the requirements?
Listen.
You have to care about what you're doing, what's going on.
Yeah. To submit. Submit to what? First of all, you got to know what you're submitting to. Just say, I'm here to be obedient. I haven't told you what I would like for you to do yet. Well, I'm going to do whatever you tell. Watch out for that. It's good to know kind of the stipulations before you get into it, right? Well, that's the first thing that we need to do is by listening, by hearing. You have to hear it first, right? And then you follow through with proper action. That's right. To learn and follow God's law communicates that Israel must accept God's commands, mediated through Moses, and then make certain that those commands direct their behavior. Because if you don't do them, it's clear that you didn't hear. You didn't hear. True hearing did not occur. People need to listen to Moses to learn what God has to say. So the command to hear was especially important, given that the Lord made himself heard, but he did not make himself seen at Horeb. And that's way back in Deuteronomy 4. Okay. Now, question for us today. How can we ensure that our obedience to the Lord doesn't turn into legalism? Everybody know what legalism is? Think Pharisees and Sadducees, people like that. So how can we ensure that our obedience to the Lord doesn't turn into legalism?
Not different for everybody.
Different for everyone. That's interesting. We're all trying to follow the same laws, right? We are. So what happens when somebody gets legalistic about something? I want to tease this out a bit, because that's one of the complaints about the church. Not New Hope Central, just the church in general. You guys are so legalistic. What does that mean? Wow.
Start putting your own interpretation on what's been
Oh, don't work on the Sabbath. And here are the 729 definitions of work that you cannot do. And one of them just happens to be healing. And Jesus just loved to break that. He just loved it because he wasn't really breaking the Sabbath command as a whole. What had happened was the Sabbath command had been codified legalistically. And it's like this, when we get legalistic with each other, we get like nitpicky. You know, I think that's a good word. When we get legalistic with each other, we get nitpicky. And by the way, there's a time and a place for legalism. I know that in my own life, in one legal situation, a representative's attention to nitpickiness really, really helped me out. It was a nitpicky detail that I would never have picked up on, but he did. And I was very happy when he did. But there is a good nitpickiness. You need nitpicky people in the church because sometimes details need to be observed. You do. I mean, you just do. You need, and when I say nitpicky, it always sounds kind of negative, but people that are focused on details. You need those kinds of people. If Sharon Klein wasn't focused on details and scrutinized the financial reports and made sure that the offerings were counted right and deposited right and checks were made out right, we could have chaos on our hands, could we not? So we need nitpicky people, but what we don't need are people who are legalistic about the laws and people who have their own definitions about what is right and what is wrong that may not necessarily jive with what God has said. So I think that's good, Joe. That's good. Let me read you a New Testament passage, because from Luke chapter 11. I always wonder, what did Jesus have to say about this kind of stuff? Well, Luke 11 is going to help us out a little bit here. Luke 11, verses 37 through 54. I think he helps. Most of the time, Jesus helps. Sometimes he just makes me angry because I want to do what I want to do. Now, I know none of y'all have ever had this happen, but he says, no, you really shouldn't. No, you really shouldn't. He's so nice about it, though. 11:37 to 54. Listen to this. This is really simple. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisees were surprised. Here's legalism right here. They were surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. How dare you eat with unwashed hands? Then the Lord said to him, the Pharisee, now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, which they tithe. So, yeah. But you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing it. Now, one of the experts in the law really should have kept his mouth shut. One of the experts in the law answered him, Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also. I would have left him alone. I really would have. So Jesus says, oh, you want some too? Here we go. Jesus replied, and you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. Woe to you, because you built tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Because of this, God in his wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles. Some of them they will kill, and others they will persecute. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. Woe to you, experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who are entering. When Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and to besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. Now, I will point out to you here in Luke chapter 11 that Jesus says from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. If you've got a Hebrew Bible, Abel was the first murder, Zechariah the last in the order of books that they have it in. So it's Genesis and 2nd Chronicles. That's what our Bibles go, Genesis to Malachi, but theirs are different order. So he's holding them accountable for all of the blood shed from Genesis to 2nd Chronicles, which in their Bible is the beginning and the end. Now, how does this help us to understand that we don't need to be legalistic? Again, I want us to think about what Jesus is doing here. He calls them, he says, you're clean on the outside. Have anybody here got a room at their house that they wouldn't let anybody in? Why?
Because it's junky. It's
a junk room
everywhere.
It's a junk room. Now, I would not recommend the sexual ethics of the show Friends to anybody, okay? But Monica Geller is obsessively clean, and she's nitpicky, very nitpicky. But one day, late in the show, there's this door at the back of this room that's never been opened, and Chandler wants to know what's in there, and Monica doesn't want him to know. So he fiddles around and finally gets the door open, and you know what it's filled with? Carol, right here, Carol. Right there.
Oh,
And you know what it's filled with? Junk all the way to the ceiling. The whole apartment is spotless. You can eat off of the floor, but she's got this one room that's full of junk. That's what Jesus is saying about these Pharisees and Sadducees. This, you clean the outside of the cup, it looks great, but the inside it's dirty. Clean the inside of the cup. And he's getting into our hearts at that point. We've got the letter of the law. The best definition of legalism I can come up with is you observe the letter, but you don't have the heart of the law. You're not, and that's what he says when he says, oh, you tithe. Great, that's awesome. I'm glad you guys are tithing. but you don't care about justice and you don't care about the love of God, which invalidates your giving. You're legalistic. I'd rather you do both. Of course, of course, be generous, but God would rather us be more concerned about justice and the love of God first. So I think that's a little bit of what he's saying there. Don't hear what I didn't say. Giving is good. Hope. Very good. All right, let's keep going. Okay. So we need to be sure that we don't allow our obedience to turn into legalism. Okay. So he says, the Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. That whole generation is dead. The first generation that came out of Egypt, they are all dead, except for two. The two spies who came back with a favorable report when Moses sent them up. The other 10 said, we are as grasshoppers in their sight. We cannot take the land. Made God a little bit upset. And then instead of going straight up into the promised land, which would have shortened the Torah greatly, he sent them on a 40-year journey. And by the time they got to here, there's only 3 that are still alive. Moses and the 2 spies who brought back favorable reports. And that's it. The rest of them have been killed. Moses recalls here that moment when God made a covenant with Israel. This covenant reminded Israel of God's great acts of salvation and called Israel to live as God's people in light of this reality. So let me ask this question. How would you explain to someone the difference between the modern use of the word covenant? How do we use covenant these days? How do you use covenant? Or do you even use it? It's kind of an old word, isn't it? But think about like community covenants, things like that. How do you use covenant if you ever do? Or do you use a word that's kind of a synonym of covenant? Because we're going to get to something.
Agreement?
What's that?
Agreement?
Agreement. Yeah, agreement. Sure. Contract. Yeah, contract. I know we have contracts. Yeah, I know. Yeah, but how would you explain to somebody the difference between that and how that word is used in this text? Because we can't take our modern application and enforce it upon the ancient text. We first of all have to mine out what's happening here. And then we can take the word and pull it up into our current day. So when God made a covenant with the Israelites, what happened? See if you remember. You've been doing Old Testament. You should know.
It's always one way.
One way.
It
God
wasn't
made the
supposed to
promise
be.
that he would do this, this, and this. He said, if y'all do this, but most of it was on him.
Yes. Going back to Abraham, long before all of this, when God made a covenant with Abraham, it's a different covenant. But when he made a covenant, Abraham fell into a deep sleep. He cut these animals into. Great, right. All right. Hope you haven't eaten yet, or if you have, it's a little bit earlier. And Abraham falls into this deep sleep. And then God himself and God alone goes through the pieces. And he says to Abraham, come what may, I will ensure this covenant. I will fill this covenant. So he does the same thing with the Israelites. He does give them a bunch of rules. He gives them a bunch of prescriptions. He gives them the commandments. But basically he says to them, even if I send you into exile, because at the very end of Deuteronomy, there's a lot of talk where Moses is sitting there going, I know y'all aren't going to do this. I know it's going to be bad. I know it's going to be bad. I know you're going to fail at this, which has led some scholars to believe that the later chapters of Deuteronomy were perhaps edited during the exile, after the exile, before the exile to Babylon. Yeah, we can talk about that. It's fun to talk about that kind of stuff. I'll take the traditional tack. Moses is warning the Israelites, I think because he's just spent 40 years with them in the wilderness, and he knows good and doggone well that they didn't follow it, and there's a good chance that their children are not going to follow it, and their children's children are not going to follow it. So he basically cries here toward the end, knowing that all of this ruin is going to fall upon them. But he says, keep the covenant. But God, even though God may send you into exile, and he will, he'll bring you back. That theology of remnant was already present. Just as with the two spies, there's already this idea, which actually goes back to the garden, of remnant, that God will have remnant. He will have a small number of people all the time. Remember that story and with Elijah? Remember when Elijah wants to die? Elijah wants to die, Lord, he's had this big victory, and then Jezebel puts a hit out on him, and he goes running off, and he's crying, and he's, Lord, kill me now. I don't want to live anymore. I'm the only one that's left. And then God does speak to him. God does speak to him. He feeds him and sends him to Mount Horeb of all places, the same place that this is happening. And he says, Elijah, you're not alone. I have 7,000. Whenever you see that number 7 in the Bible, you know, it's what it means is I've got a remnant. I've got a remnant of people who have not bowed their knee to Baal. I'm telling you, I've got some people, and you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay, and we're going to be okay. God always has a remnant, but it's important for us still to keep up our end of the bargain. It really is. It's not good to say, well, I'll disobey because ultimately I know that God's going to have a remnant, you know, and it's going to be okay. Well, it may, and it may not. Okay. It may or may not. I think some of us just assume that we're going to be a part of that remnant. And, you know, I won't finish that one. Okay. All right. We know that story, right? All right. Okay. All right. Let's move on. Let's look here. I'm going over to the passage in Deuteronomy chapter 10. And I want us to look at verse 12 particularly. Because there's a question. Everything okay?
Yes, they needed more chairs. There is a room full. So we got almost all the chairs out of the storage room.
Well,
That's amazing. That's wonderful.
That's great.
Yeah.
About 10 o'clock. Pretty
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
Well,
that's great.
they're hoping to be out of here by 7:30. Well, no, everybody be done. Well, I'll get them tomorrow. No big deal.
It doesn't matter. Just leave them out. I like to walk
I'll
around.
leave them out
Hey,
for tonight anyway.
Moses says, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? Sounds like Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? Look at what he says here. He gives a clear answer. Verse 12, he says, to fear the Lord your God. And that's not to be afraid. That's to have reverential respect for him. Fear the God. Fear the God. Okay? To walk in obedience to him. The fear, I mentioned this Sunday during the text, during the sermon. It's the salvation that prompts the works, not the works that earns the salvation. The same thing here. The walking in obedience shows the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord should be there, but here it shows itself in obedient walk. And then the next one is to love God, to love him. Moses expresses the centrality of love. He challenges Israel to love the Lord your God. Where have I heard this before? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. My gosh, that's Jesus, isn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah, he knew his Bible, didn't he? Wow, wow, wow. Yeah, to serve God with all your heart, with all your soul. Love makes it a joy to serve the Lord. Now, for the ancient Israelites, we have to think of the heart as kind of the center of a person, not the organ that's pumping blood, hopefully, as the location of an individual's volition. It's right here in the middle, okay? All right, so here we have these 4 prescriptions: fear, walk, love, and serve. Which of these, if anyone wants to just be, just kind of testimonial here, confessional even maybe. Which of these, fear, walk, love, or serve, do you need to focus on more in your life? Fear, walking obediently. Fear of the Lord, walking obediently, being in love with God, serving God. Which of those? I mean, you know, just
Walking obediently for me.
obedient.
Yeah, it's got what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I've noticed that about you.
I need to work on all four.
Right.
I'm still working.
Yes.
All four.
Get stronger in all four.
See, I think it's without a healthy fear of the Lord. And again, I'm not talking about being scared of God. I grew up scared of God. I grew up, you know, waiting for the other shoe to fall, waiting for, well, there's Rick. I think Rick wants to say something. He finally unmuted himself. Rick, go ahead, buddy.
Well,
Now he muted himself back. Carol,
here we go.
better get used to. Hey, Rick, go ahead, buddy.
I was thinking the same thing you were thinking just before you said it. I would fear the Lord first, then understand
Yeah,
what that fear means,
Yeah.
and then I can service them and love them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Without that healthy fear, and not that negative fear, but the healthy fear, I think one follows the other. I think you're right. I think it's that fear motivates the obedience. The obedience motivates the love, and the love prompts the service. Yeah, I think it really does. I think it's almost like Moses knew what he was saying. I mean, almost. But I do think it does flow like that. But I grew up waiting for God to smush me. I heard a lot of the hellfire and brimstone. Now, I never heard it in Sunday school. You know, and I always figured that they were lying in Sunday school. The truth was being told upstairs. But I always figured that in children's church, it was just babysitting with Bible verses and Kool-Aid while the adults got the real stuff upstairs. But when I was old enough to go upstairs, what I was hearing upstairs did jive with what I was hearing in Sunday school. I heard about God who loved me, God who made me, all those happy stories about the ark on the flannel graph and everything. They were missing some characters. I always had the giraffe with his head sticking out of the top, and you always had all the animals. But what you didn't have in the water around the boat were all the people dying, clawing at the bottom of the ark. You know, I didn't learn about that till seminary. I didn't know about that part of the ark story. I didn't know that, they didn't traumatize us, I guess, but I didn't know about that. But I went upstairs, everybody was dying and going to hell unless they repented and got saved. And I mean, everybody, even that sweet lady who used to sit, Miss Tim, used to sit on the second row on the left. And I don't think she ever sinned in her life. She was on her way to hell unless she repented and got right with God. And it just seemed like everybody needed to get right every Sunday, and I don't know, but that's what I heard. So I was afraid of God. I really was. But God doesn't want us to be afraid of him. God wants us to draw near. God wants us to fear him and honor him and reverence him. And then by our obedience and our love and our service, show that we belong to him. See, the thing about it is I was never really introduced to Jesus all that much, except that he was born of a virgin and then he died on a cross and that he's alive again. And one day, he's coming back with a big old stick. Now I'm paraphrasing, but you know what I mean. He's coming back to kick tail, basically. I didn't hear anything about the person of Jesus. I didn't hear anything about who he was, how he might have been, what does the Bible say? What did the gospel say? What kind of guy was he? Well, I didn't hear about that really until I went to seminary. And so it was our Bible college. So anyway, hey, let's do that. Rick, I'm glad you chimed in, man. That's great. We need to fear the Lord. We need to be obedient. We need to love him. We need to serve him. All right, so let me see what else we got here. Y'all are doing great. How are we doing on time? No good at all. All right. So let's see. Same scriptures here. Let me see. No, I'm moving on to the Deuteronomy 27 text now. And I really think, look with me at verse 7. Deuteronomy chapter 27. Verse 10. No, verse 7. I think this is great. Look what he says here. We're building an altar. Okay, we're going into the land. We're going to build an altar and we're going to write the law on it. Look what he says here. He says, sacrifice fellowship offerings there, eating them, and here's the key word, rejoicing in the presence of the Lord your God. So we're going to do burnt offerings and we're going to do fellowship offerings. Fellowship offerings burned only a portion of the sacrificial animal. The remaining portions were to be used by the worshipers in what amounted to a fellowship with God meal. Potluck. There you go. Or pot animal. I mean, I don't know. It's just an animal. But we have in Leviticus 3, 1-17 can tell you more than you would ever want to know about this. Okay. But this would provide a time for Israel to rejoice in the presence of the Lord as the meal reminded them of God's presence and faithfulness. By the way, it's one of the things that the Lord's Supper should also do for us, is remind us of God's presence there in that. So let me ask you this. These are acts of worship that were to be acts of celebration. So let's dig a little deeper. What greater personal attention do we need to give to the idea of rejoicing in God? To rejoice in God. I've told you, I've had times where I have felt so blessed that I just thought about just yelling, glory to Jesus. But I thought, well, I better not do that. We don't do that down at the New Hope Church. I admit it.
Do we do it at home? Do we scream
I will
out
not
good?
tell you anything that I do at
Scream
home.
out and say,
I
thank you,
will not-
Jesus.
I will not, I
Hallelujah.
will not tell you
Ah,
anything that I do at home. My neighbors probably know more than I want them to know. I had to go home today and in the middle of the day to take care of something. And I got home and I turned my stereo on, and my stereo is right up against the wall to the neighbor's house. I mean, it's a pretty good distance to the neighbor's house. I got a beautiful oak tree right next to it, the neighbor's house. And I came back out. I was only home for about 20 minutes. And I came back out and he said, "Oh, rocking out upstairs, huh?" Again, he says, "Yes, again." And I was like, I said, "Yeah, I was. Yeah, you know, but anyway, yeah, I like my music loud." But no, what I meant was, so, sometimes decorum can take precedence over exuberant, ecstatic praise. Sometimes decorum in a worship setting, even though it really wasn't about me, which is the important thing, by the way. If you feel that urge to raise your hand, stand up, say glory to Jesus, say amen or something like that, the only thing that Paul tells us is just make sure you're not glorifying yourself. Okay. Carol, it looks like we're going to have to get you one of those Fitbits so we can count your steps, which is the most useless thing in the world.
Or skates, so you can get out.
Or skates, so you can go down there. We've got a really big crowd down at the Boy Scouts thing, so that's great. But Carol's Alfred's having to go back and forth. So anyway,
And find more chairs, but I found 4 more.
I think she looked really good.
well, we'll just let them meet in the sanctuary. There's plenty of room up there.
Maybe next week you want to meet here.
That's not a bad idea, but anyway.
Tonight, parents are there because it's the first night and it's orientation and filling out forms. So I don't think it'll be just kids probably, with maybe a few parents after tonight.
Yeah. And they'll be moving into the rooms too. So that's good. So what can we do? What can we do to give greater personal attention to the idea of rejoicing in God personally? Are we rejoicing?
Personally,
Yeah.
I think, God answers so many of my prayers.
Yes, sir.
And I kept notes of the prayers he answered, and I put them in a file. I says, maybe someday my children or grandchildren will read that and understand how precious God is.
All right.
And that's my enjoyment of understanding what he does for us.
That's wonderful. That's great, man.
Yes, it is.
Wonderful.
It's inspiring.
Yes. It happens to me when I'm listening to music a lot. And it doesn't have to be necessarily Jesus music.
No.
It can be really anything that's excellent. The other day I was listening to, well, yesterday actually, I was listening to, I know you all love Franz Schubert and as leader, his German leader, you're like, who are you talking about? Hitler? No, leader, Lieder. Songs. Franz Schubert was a wonderful composer of songs. And they're beautiful. Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, one of the best baritone voices of the 20th century, really ever. Performed them all. And they're available, Apple Music is so cool. But they're there and I was listening to them in my office and I just had a moment there where I just kind of just sitting back going, oh my gosh, these beautiful chord progressions, this beautiful voice, this beautiful accompanist. Wow. And I don't know what he was singing about. He may have been singing about some girl in a German, I don't know, but it was beautiful. And I don't know, I don't know a lot of German. I know ein Jüngling liebt ein Mädchen, which I'm sure if Hoyt were on, he would tear me apart, telling me how I mispronounced it. But I only know the German I learned for some of my songs at school. But the bottom line was I didn't have to understand it. I understood the people. And I gave God glory for that. I don't think I screamed. Didn't yell. Right? She didn't hear anything. So, yeah.
What they say about music is universal love.
Yeah, there's something special about music, y'all. There's just something so special about music. It just really is. The universe sings itself. We were in awe the other night driving back from the Classic City. We noticed how close and bright Saturn was to the moon, and Jupiter was just over here. And we did the trip a couple of times, and we noticed that the moon was right here. Saturn was here one night. And when we came out the second night, the moon was pretty much in the same spot. Saturn was over here. Saturn was booking. Saturn making its way around. And Jupiter is over here. I mean, it's just so beautiful. I mean, those stars sing. They really do. The heavens are telling the glory of God. Yeah, I think. Yeah. Wow. Okay. I got one more for y'all. Okay. Y'all ready for this? And then we'll be done. But let's look at verses 9 and 10. Same place.
Chapter, so what?
27, Deuteronomy 27. Yeah. That's all right. You've been on the conveyor. So here we go. Moses and the Levitical priests said, to all Israel, listen to what he says here. Be silent, Israel, and listen. You have now become the people of the Lord your God. So there is a time for silent worship as well before God. It's not the only way you should worship. No, goodness gracious. No. I imagine that when temple worship got going at its height, it was loud. We get this idea that it was all very. I'm sorry, if you have percussion instruments, it ain't gonna be. It's gonna be loud. There's gonna be dancers. They had dancers. They were temple dancers. They were dancing. David was a dancer. The idea that he didn't probably wasn't all that good, but he was making a joyful dance. His wife said he was making a spectacle of himself, but he said, I'm dancing before the Lord, mind your business. So it was loud. It was moving. So the final question I'll ask you tonight, what can we do to overcome a tendency to talk too much and listen too little? And listening and hearing are two entirely different things. I can hear you speak to me. I may not be listening. Have you ever been talking to somebody? It may be me. I mean, that's okay. I mean, shake your head, yes. I don't want to know. Okay, there you go. You're talking to me. I can hear every word you say. But sometimes I may not be listening. Have you ever found yourself in that position?
Hard time
Often.
listening sometimes.
A lot of times we are too busy formulating what we're going to say in response
Mhm.
to what we're hearing. Right? Correcting you. Well, let me tell you, I didn't ask, you know. No, I don't care. I'm gonna give it to you anyway, right? I'm gonna give it to you anyway. What can we do? I mean, the best thing we can do is listen. Times to be- Go ahead. Whoever would like to speak. No, they're both muted.
Oh, okay.
But my thing is, best thing we can do is we can practice. We can practice listening. Silent prayer with the Lord. By just being silent in our time of prayer. Just saying, speak, Lord. Your servant is listening. And then just shh. Don't say anything else. And just listen. And then what'll happen is it'll be awkward. Awkward the first few times. You'll say nothing happened. And I'll say, do it again. Remember that story? 1 Samuel, I think it was. Where the boy Samuel hears a voice. Samuel, Samuel. He gets up and he goes in and he runs to Eli. You called me? Yes, sir. I didn't call you. Go back. Goes back down. Samuel, Samuel. He gets up again. Goes into Eli. I'm here. What do you want? I didn't call you. Go back and lay down again. And when he speaks to you this time, say this. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. He sends it back. Samuel, Samuel. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Notice what he says. Your servant is listening. Samuel, a young boy who was attentive. We're told he didn't know the Lord yet. He'd been serving in the temple since he was a wee lad. But he didn't know the Lord, the author tells us. Probably him. Probably Samuel. So he didn't know the Lord, but he was listening. And God gave him a word. Not the best word for Eli and his offspring. But he heard because he was listening. He was silent and quiet. So there is a place for exuberant praise, obviously. There is a place for jubilation, loud voices, dancing, the whole thing. But there is also a place. I always think of Christmas Eve as that place. Good Friday is that place. Holy Saturday is that place of silence. Monday, Thursday is that place of silence before the Lord. While we're receiving communion on Sunday mornings, it's a good place for silence. And I think that's more in reverence and in awe. But hey, if we're in the middle of communion and all of a sudden your heart is bursting to say something like glory to Jesus, I hope you won't be like your chicken minister and not do it. Because if it's not about you, it's acceptable before the Lord. I believe that. I believe it. I really do. It may not be decorum, it may not be, but then again, was Jesus ever all that interested in stuff like that? Not really. Not really. What Jesus was interested in was this right here. Our heart and our walk. That's what he's interested in. All right. So anyway, here we have the Israelites on the cusp of entering the promised land. It's filled with milk and honey, we were told. Sounds sticky, doesn't it, Carol? Filled with milk and honey. And there they are, and they're getting the best sermons they'll ever get in their lives. from us. I pray that we will be interested in justice, that we will be people of justice and obedience. Let's pray, and we'll be done. Father, I thank you for this time that we've had together tonight. Thank you for the overpouringness of the Boy Scout venture. Glad that this is coming back. Thank you for the time that we've had together tonight. Thank you for the technology that makes it possible for more to join in. Go with us as we depart tonight. Lord, help us to always be respectful of one another and respectful of you and the worship spaces that we inhabit. But help us to always be ready to be exuberant in our thanks and praise to you. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Bye, guys. Bye, Peggy. Bye, Rick.